share just a few. Ah, there we go. I'm going to share just a few slides to ground our conversation in the paper that Chris and I wrote. First of all, we set out to understand how ERPOs were actually functioning on the ground. We dug up news stories, we talked to practitioners, we followed threads that would give us insight into how and why these tools were and weren't being used. And what we kept finding over and over was that context and nuance matter more than the law, more than the politics, and much more than we expected. At the most basic level, we found that ERPOs are not uniform tools. So, what makes this paper distinctive? It is a systematic analysis of the contextual factors that explain why ERPOs function as fundamentally different instruments across different states. Now, why that matters to all of you that are here, understanding this and understanding how these tools function in context allows you to assess for intentional usage in your given jurisdiction. And we believe that that unlocks the full potential of these laws. So the dominant metric for ERPO success has been petition volume, how many ERPOs are being done. We did an analysis across these four states, Massachusetts, Florida, Connecticut, and California. And I think we see that there's a much more complicated picture, and we can't just assess based upon petition volume. Every case breaks a different assumption. So Massachusetts, the assumption there may be that low volume equals underperformance. Massachusetts files almost no ERPOs, yet they have one of the lowest firearm mortality rates in the country. In Florida, the assumption may be that politics will predict ERPO implementation, and we don't see that in Florida. There's a Republican-trifecta there. They have permitless-carry. They have one of the highest ERPO implementation rates in the nation, and this is even across deeply conservative rural counties. In Connecticut, the assumption may be that design determines effectiveness. So Connecticut was the first ERPO law, and it has a high evidentiary threshold. It follows warrant procedures. There is no family access, and yet we still see a 13.7% reduction in firearm suicides in Connecticut. And then California, the fourth state in the analysis, the assumption is that maybe that a good law practically implements itself. California is the ideal political conditions for ERPO. It follows a civil protection model. There is broad access, and we see in San Diego, though, that they have transformed the statute through leadership, while neighboring counties in California barely use the law. So we started to look at what explains these counterintuitive insights. Why does the same tool in name produce completely different outcomes across states and even across counties within the same state? So within the paper, we've identified 5 dimensions that transform ERPO from a uniform policy into a context-specific tool. And we feel that these are really important to understanding what you're actually working with in your given jurisdiction. So those 5 dimensions are first, legal frameworks. That's going to be how the law is written, who can petition, to what evidentiary standards are required. Does the law follow criminal or civil procedure? These are foundational choices that shape everything that happens after that. And then we have regulatory ecosystems. That's looking at what other firearm laws exist around this tool. So what other alternative pathways are there? And how does ERPO integrate with or duplicate what is already there? Massachusetts is probably the clearest example of this dimension at work. And, Jay can tell us a little bit more about that. The next dimension is implementation infrastructure. So that's training, dedicated units, data systems, organizational support, court access. We see that those have a really big impact on how the tool is used. San Diego didn't have a better law than the rest of California. It simply has better infrastructure around the law. Then we have political and cultural context. This is looking at how the tool is framed, whether law enforcement leadership has bought into using the tool. Sometimes it can involve a focusing event like what we saw in Florida after Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, and that helps to create some momentum. And then we also have geographic disparities. That's going to be looking at how usage varies across regions within the same state and considering what rural barriers may exist, what communities may face, and determining how implementation could possibly reach the places that need it. So together, these 5 dimensions give jurisdictions a framework for asking questions, questions that can help you better understand what your ERPO actually is in practice, rather than understanding it merely in terms of the statute. So in closing, and so we can get to the discussion, I think it's important, read the paper and to look at the framework and consider this a framework for self-understanding and for opening up the next generation of research questions, but it is also meant to be used right now. I am, along with 97%, working with AGs and jurisdictions to assess their existing ERPO policies and their implementation, and to help them understand what their ERPO is in practice, and then to find where those opportunities for refinement exist. So in terms of operationalizing the framework, we put up here 4 primary questions that we bring as we're assessing ERPO in a jurisdiction. And that is, these are questions you can use. What does your current operational framework look like around these orders? How are local conditions shaping the application and also the perception of these orders? How do ERPOs function in relation to your existing broader regulatory landscape? And then lastly, where do gaps in service occur and what variables may be driving these inequities? And lastly, if anybody would like to reach out directly to myself or to Chris, I put our emails up there. And I think that's it, and I'll pass it back to Dr. Atlas.
Yeah, thank you, Tara. I'd like to just underscore that this is a very, very important report. I strongly encourage you to take a look at the entire report, which is available on the 97% website. And it does a really nice job of looking at these 4 case studies of Connecticut, California, Massachusetts, and Florida. And as Stacy noted, I'm a comparative political scientist by training. And looking at the cases made me notice a few things that I thought were interesting. And just one point I want to make that really struck me as I was reading the report, and that is that in many ways, Florida and Massachusetts, their approaches and the context that they exist in sort of represent opposite endpoints along an ERPO continuum. Massachusetts with arguably the most heavily regulated state when it comes to firearms. Florida, a very pro-gun state. It's also the only red state of the 4 that is examined. It's also the only state with permitless-carry of the 4. And it's very interesting that these are so different, and yet the results of in dealing with violence prevention we'll get into that, and I think that's interesting, and you can read it in the paper. But what I also wanted to point out, and I'm very grateful, is that on our panel, all 3 panelists with law enforcement experience, Chris and Ian have experience in Florida, and Jay is in Massachusetts. And so they could actually address some of these key differences and context between these two sort of extreme cases that I thought were pretty interesting. So I'd like to start the ball rolling with sort of a general question. And that is, as Tara just noted, the paper does sort of document a wide range of contextual factors that vary across states, but also vary within states themselves. That impact on ERPO implementation, differences in law, the law itself, in the political culture, the resources, the agency structure. And I'd like to ask each of the panelists, based on your own experiences and your knowledge of your own states and localities, where can you tell us a particular story or anecdote that sort of captures where some of these differences really mattered or made a difference? And we can, I guess, start with Ian.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. Hopefully I don't freeze while we go through this. Well, first off, I want to say thank you for allowing me to participate in this. I think it's a great discussion, and I'm happy to contribute. Um, I would say that my introduction to ERPOs and this whole targeted violence prevention world came in 2018 as I was onboarding with the JTTF unit down in the Miami division. And it coincided with the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting, which unfortunately is about a mile and a half away from my house. So it was very much my community. It affected us greatly. It was the watershed moment, as Tara sort of pointed out, in Florida, that sort of galvanized an idea that we need to do more, and it resulted in some crafting of legislation that created laws that have been quite helpful. I almost look back and wonder how we were doing the things we were doing without them now in terms of targeted violence prevention. But I also think we weren't looking at the problem in the same way until after that incident. So I think that's partly why we now are looking towards this as an invaluable tool in overall behavioral threat assessment and management. You're going to hear me repeat that a lot because I think that's what this is. It's a tool in the overall context of behavioral threat assessment and management to prevent targeted violence specifically. But it happened in 2018 in February. The legislation came about a month and a half later, very quickly passed. And then, at least in the South Florida area, particularly my AOR, Palm Beach County, we really took it and ran. And we happened to have the right people in the right place at that time that were looking at doing more. And I think the context in terms of law enforcement expectations from the public also changed. We were under a great deal of scrutiny in how we responded to the incident itself. That was quite a black eye. It resulted in the first time we charged a police officer for failing to act. There was quite a bit going on there, and I think the community overall felt that we can do better, and law enforcement down there seemed to respond to that challenge, I think, and we started working towards that. So simultaneously, my agency adopted the idea that we are going to create a threat assessment unit. Palm Beach County, which is sort of a juggernaut in this space, they have an amazing sheriff who has resourced and provided key leadership in the development of their program. And they now are sort of a model for the nation in terms of going out and teaching what they do. They were an amazing partner in this. So between the FBI, Palm Beach County, and then my agency, it was just sort of what was happening. And we were all very much on board with working towards this goal. And so that's kind of, we created an MOU. All the cities, law enforcement, municipalities, universities, K through 12, they all signed on to this thing. So we started with a threat management team focus on how we were going to try and prevent targeted violence. The ERPOs were never questioned in terms of whether or not it was something we were going to adopt or do. It was just new. So there were questions regarding how do we implement this thing? It's a civil order. What are the realities behind testifying, evidentiary, how we're going to serve them, things of that nature. So it was more practical in how we use them. That we had a lot of question marks. But again, the agencies down there were very proactive in leaning into this new tool and utilizing it. So we just learned from each other, right? We worked from the ones that were doing more of them that would teach the other ones that were not doing as many. I won't say that we had 100% buy-in all the way from the agencies that were participating. That varying degrees of buy-in occurred. Unfortunately, sometimes it was post-incident. So we had those that were at the table, that were attending the meetings, but not really contributing. But as soon as an incident occurred in their neighborhood, in their jurisdiction that they had to respond to, we saw them step up and take more of an active part in understanding what this was. And all of a sudden you saw more ERPOs coming along from those organizations. So unfortunately, it seems that it requires an incident to be the catalyst for folks to sort of move towards adopting these things in a more proactive way. But that's sort of how I share this, is not from doing as many ERPOs. I was involved in more of the overall BTAM and threat management coalition that started to coalesce at that time. And it was an amazing sort of look into how we're going to make this thing work with varying levels of buy-in. The chiefs, by and large, had all bought in with the sheriff's strategy, so we didn't have any problem top down there. I think we're going to discuss sort of leadership, but it's absolutely key in having any successful implementation of this sort of tool for an organization or within the jurisdictions, the circuits. So I think that answers the question if it didn't ramble too much. But
yeah, great. That's great. Thank you.
Sure.
Jay, what do you think?
Thank you. Similar to Ian, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. When I first became involved, it's one of these things. I was a police officer for about 20 years at the time. And in Massachusetts, we have some very strict firearms laws. So I started teaching at William James College, and we were doing a suicidality and a safer storage conversation that turned into a class. And added a little piece into my portion. I'm not a lawyer, but adding a little piece of my portion into the law that I start the class out with. And the red flag ERPO started getting traction. We got a call from a news station, and you know it exists as a Massachusetts police officer. You know it's there. But because a chief of police in a city or town is a licensing authority, they have, I don't want to say absolute power, but they can suspend or revoke and also approve. So ERPOs aren't a huge thing in Massachusetts, but they're on the books. And as this class evolved more and more, I would say 2021, 2022, people started coming to us, news agencies. One in particular in the Boston area came to us and said, we'd love to come videotape you. We'd love to get interviews. So we did that. And a chief from somewhere in Massachusetts, he was unnamed in the article, said, oh, we do those all the time, which led me to say, hold on. I've been around a while. I love doing street crime stuff. I know that I've never done one. I've been on the end of trying to recover firearms and ammunition. If one has been issued, I think I've been involved in one or two, but mostly when the licensing authority, the chief of police in whatever city or town, going there and seizing the firearms, seizing the ammunition. So when that got traction, I started to look into it, and I said, we don't do any in Massachusetts. 6 million people, similar to the state of Washington population-wise. We don't do a lot. And then we had the Firearm Reform Act come into law in 2024, signed in July of 24. Some of the things that are still taking effect, but mostly took effect in October, and it expanded the ERPO. So we incorporated that into our safer storage suicidality class and tried to get it out to more people. And that's pretty much my, I don't want to say indoctrination, but that's kind of how it's progressed in my career so far. Knowing it's there, rarely used, as you can see the stats over the years, and then it really coming forward when we're trying to get out the safer storage suicidality part of giving mental health professionals, doctors, schools, an idea of the ability with the new law of how they can look into ERPOs.
Thank you. Again, you're sort of underscoring just how different Massachusetts is compared to a lot of other states, which is fascinating. So, Chris, you have law enforcement experience, but you also train departments on ERPOs. Are there any particular anecdotes or stories that sort of you can bring in that sort of flesh this out a little bit?
Sure. So it's actually funny. When I got transferred to the threat response unit for the Fort Lauderdale Police Department and started doing risk protection order case investigations, at that same time I started my MPH at Johns Hopkins. So I had just started my program there. I got to meet and work with the folks, the architects of the modern ERPO, the civil framework for the ERPO. So I was learning about the research behind this. So then I remember my first case was a young man in crisis who was threatening to bring an AK-47 pistol to a corner to settle a problem he was having. My second case was a domestic violence stalker where the woman was scared to death and was too afraid to go to court herself. And so we used an ERPO to intervene in that case. And then my third case was a woman who had called in that her ex-husband was in crisis. He had been in the hospital. He had been taken for a Baker Act for an involuntary commitment, was only there for the couple of days and was released. And he had firearms at home. And I remember going to our city attorney and saying, hey, we have this case. She's still concerned. I think we need to move forward with an ERPO. And he told me no. And I was getting all this data from Johns Hopkins. Oh, it's great for suicide prevention. Look at the stats from Connecticut. And, I was good friends with the city attorney, and we had a great professional relationship. And I'm a New Yorker, so I like to argue. So is he. So we argued about it. And I was insisting, no, this is what this is for. This is what this is for. And he flat out told me, no, it's not. We had the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting. And the only reason that this legislature passed this law is so that we could prevent shootings. This is not a tool for suicide. And I had to back down. He outranked me. But what was interesting was we used it, and we used it really well to prevent interpersonal violence at the beginning. And then as I learned more about behavioral threat assessment and what suicidality meant in the broader picture of somebody who may be on a pathway to hurt others, those suicidal thoughts may be part of a bigger picture where somebody could lash out eventually. And as we learned more, the city attorney softened. He started to see suicidal thoughts and suicidal threats as part of a bigger problem, and potentially part of a bigger problem. And we started using the tool about a year and a half, and we started to use the tool a little more broadly. And we started to acknowledge some of the cases where there was only a threat of suicide and not necessarily a larger threat. But it took time. It took training. It took me being loud and obnoxious and keep pushing this forward and keep bringing the argument back to him. And I give him a lot of credit. In the state of Florida, I think the onus he was right. It was passed in Florida to prevent acts of violence, to prevent another Marjorie Stoneman Douglas from happening. And he didn't want us to become overburdened and dedicate too many resources to suicide prevention, which, whether you agree with that or not, that politically speaking, that is where the focus was here in Florida when we passed this law. And that's changed over time, and it's broadened. And a big part of that, and I take that into our training and into how it's really about the big picture and seeing where ERPO can help solve a problem that you may not have been able to solve some other way, or how it can help you solve a problem in the context of other tools that you're also using, whether connecting someone to services or reconnecting them with family and supportive people in their lives. But it really was interesting to start out having that context from Hopkins and the folks who had designed this law, and seeing it on the ground and seeing the motivation for using it being very different here in Florida from maybe what the people who the architects of this law may have intended. So bring that around to say, things like education and training and learning how else this can be applied, and also focusing on using it well for where you see your problem, right? So Florida saw the problem in that we didn't have a way to stop a kid from showing up at a school with a firearm. So that's where the focus started. And then as we got better at using the law, as we got better at using this tool to intervene, we saw that it was a good tool for other forms of threats of violence, other forms of gun violence, suicide. More agencies were open to using it for domestic cases, even though we have domestic violence protection orders as well. So what was interesting was we were laser focused on doing it really, really well in this one way at the very beginning. But once we got good at using the tool and were comfortable using the tool, we were then much more comfortable using it in a broader context and still using it well and within the parameters of the Constitution.
That's really interesting. And from my perspective, like looking at it from more of an academic, studying and teaching gun violence, the idea that you would have sort of this tunnel vision, pardon me, but I mean, it's sort of a tunnel vision approach to it's only for like a mass shooting or a school shooting. It seems, from my perspective, it's like that's just one type of gun violence, relatively small type. statistically speaking. And as we all know, many mass shooters are suicidal as well. And this idea that we can no, we can only this is what it's for. We can't do anything else with it. It strikes me as a bit odd, but I understand where that's coming from.
Yeah.
And
Can I
then
interrupt for 1 second,
yeah,
Pierre?
yeah.
I want to. So Lori Berman just threw something in the Q&A that I thought was worth. It makes me feel better. So Lori Berman, it was one of the original sponsors of the Florida ERPO law after MSD, and she's on the call today. And she said in her comment that she always intended for it to also apply to suicide. And so I feel better that I had my arguments, but unfortunately, and this is kind of exactly what we're talking about, right? The intention when the law is put in versus the culture and the reality on the ground, and bridging that gap. Making sure that we're educating the law enforcement as to what the full intention of the law is, and making sure that those. But Lori, thank you. You make me feel better. I've been holding on to that for about 7 years.
So, well, that's.
Can I just echo sort of what Chris said? Our experience over with our city was very similar. There was a definite gap in understanding that we needed to bring this tool, this legal process to our city attorneys, who are not well versed in what is obviously a new law anyway, but working through this. So there was quite a learning curve there, trying to get them on board in an expeditious way. It was in the beginning days in terms of turnaround between a review and a movement forward to the process of serving, which at the end turned into hours or minutes. Frankly, they understood what this was all about. So we experienced a very similar sort of process of getting them involved, educating them, understanding when we send this, it requires a sense of urgency to look into. And that definitely was part of the growing pains that we experienced, as well as starting more narrow and then realizing we can graduate this policy to other acts of violence, and being better at utilizing it, being judicious about it, but utilizing it in better ways. Over.
So this actually, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Pierre. Go.
So this is sort of actually begs the next set of questions that I wanted to bring up, which is about the role of leadership. In my public affairs and criminal justice classes, I have a mantra: leaders matter. And it, obviously policy matters, the law matters, but as Tara noted in the presentation and what you guys are already saying, who is in a position of authority at a key moment in time can make all the difference in the world in terms of how you even interpret the law and all that kind of stuff. So I'd like to ask all of you, basically, if you could sort of share some thoughts and again, experiences and general thoughts for the audience about the role of leadership. Maybe going a little bit beyond what you just said about, how important are leaders on the ground? What happens when you have a leader that might not be as supportive? What happens when leaders change, either with a new administration or just attrition or whatever? And is there an onboarding of getting people involved and committed to the ERPO? And I'd like, from your experience on the ground, and also Tara, from the research, did you find any general comments or frames that you want to share about the role of leadership and how important that is in the context of implementing ERPOs?
Yeah, I mean, we found that leadership probably was more instrumental in ERPO being used effectively than any of the other dimensions beyond how the statute is written. I mean, obviously, there's some things that kind of down the line come from really strong leadership, which tends to be, resources. There's an investment of resources. So, dedicated ERPO teams, money going to training. So, there's impacts from that leadership, but just having a committed leader really transformed whether the tool is being used or it's not. And I think that's part of the reason why we see, we looked at these state to state. So you see these disparities between the states, but you also see huge disparities of usage within single states. So, Florida, when you just look at the numbers in terms of overall usage, it uses more ERPOs than most of the other states. It's, in the top, usage numbers consistently. But we see it being used in very concentrated areas. And those are the places where there has been committed leadership, committed resources, there has been dedicated training, dedicated units. And where those things don't exist, ERPO usage is nearly non-existent. So it's vital. And I think to your question though, you can have leadership at the top, and that's obviously ideal to have investment at the top. But I think Chris can probably speak a little bit to this in his experience, even when there's not full buy-in at the top, even just a few, I mean, well-trained but dedicated detectives who are doing this work, who are committed to using ERPO, can still really make a difference. So that leadership can really show up at different levels of ERPO usage, and it's important at all of them, but it can still be beneficial even if it only exists at one level.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I remember early on, I had a conversation with our assistant chief, and it was about one of our cases, and I was really surprised that he was so open to us, so it was myself and my old partner Jack. So he was very open to the two of us handling a case in a pretty unorthodox way. Meeting with the family and talking it out and holding off on the ERPO until we had learned a little more. And he gave us a lot of trust in that case. And then I remember debriefing it with him afterwards, and I give him a lot of credit. He told us, he said, "Listen, I don't know how to do this kind of work. We were when I was a detective, we showed up after the mess was already made. We cleaned it up and we took the bad guy to jail. This is not the kind of investigation I ever learned how to do. And I'm trusting you guys that you've gone out and gotten the training and the education to know how to do these things. I'm trusting your judgment." And he was instrumental when our chief, so he was our assistant chief, when our chief was a little hesitant with the way a case was being handled. He really did a tremendous job of backing us up. So I think it's important. Listen, I think it's important for people in command to educate themselves on how these tools work, and educate themselves on what the strongest policies might look like, and learn from their community. But I think you have to, if you're in leadership and it's been 15, 20 years since you've been on the road, you have to look to the guys on the road, and you have to listen and hear and take their advice, and take the leadership from the ground up, and incorporate that, and really take the value in that. I think that's how a unit is successful, because your job after 20, your job as an assistant chief is not to relearn how to do an investigation. It's to support the people who are now responsible to do those investigations as best you can.
If
Right.
I can add to that, just, something that's really important, I think that the paper highlights as well, is how important it is to consider the cultural and political elements at play where you are using the particular tool. So, talking about ground up implementation of it, listening to those detectives who have been trained. I think we also see it being utilized in a more effective way, where the framing of it, the way the detectives are talking about it, respects some of the concerns that may exist in that community. If you have a community that, is really, proponents of the 2A, and they want to protect that right, and that's really important to them, you have to respect that. And I think making it clear that there's due process built into this law, and understanding what is needed to be communicated to community members to address concerns that they may have with it. I think that kind of ground up element is really important too.
Yeah, it seems to me that there's a lot of potential misinformation or misunderstanding that isn't just within the general public, but potentially among police chiefs or others as well. And that I think your point about understanding what it is and talking to people on the ground makes a lot of sense.
Can I ask
Jay or
something?
Ian, did you have you wanted to contribute?
Yeah,
Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, just with the leadership thing, I'm two things. One, on the leadership part, whether it's back from my military days or now, I'm big on informal leadership. People can have rank, but similar to what Chris was saying, we need to get the investigators. I think back to a time before I transferred to Framingham about 13 years ago. I spent time as a detective with another department. And I remember helping a 3-letter agency out with a motorcycle gang issue that was going on. And they are very creative in how they move their firearms around. And I remember going to my previous chief, who phenomenal guy, still friends with him, and saying, "We've got this. They're moving firearms around. The felons don't have it, but the guy with no record, who's a prospect, or the guy who just got patched in, he's driving this vehicle around, and we've got info on it. And I remember going to him and saying, listen, we've got this investigation. This officer saw it, young officer, and two parts. One, him having the authority, not under an ERPO, but the licensing authority being able to take care of the matter and it being done immediately. So though we don't use the ERPOs in that way, we have that function, as I said, when we started. And it was almost immediate. Looking at it, though, you look at these other states, Florida and California, talk about big states. In Massachusetts, we're a big department. There's only 140 some odd of us. That's a neighborhood in most states. But we can do it pretty quickly. We can go to we have a lieutenant in our department that's in charge of licensing, to include firearms licensing. And we can go right to them. We have something where an officer does a great job or a detective does a great job doing investigation, may not be criminal charges, but they found something. We can get right to them, small enough department. They go right to the chief and start, taking the wheels in motion with getting that license carry either suspended or revoked.
Okay. And Ian, how about you? Any thoughts on leadership?
Oh, I've got plenty of thoughts on leadership. Leadership is key, in my opinion, right? So we came, our chief had a vision and an intent. It was communicated with the sergeant who was developing the unit. And there was sort of an understanding, although it wasn't clear what that framework was going to look like. What we found is there was sort of a disconnect between middle management, who was going to oversee that unit, and what the expectations were for it, the metrics for which it was going to be judged by, right? So more to the idea that we were cops that would show up after something had happened, and we would base our data on arrests, seizures, charges, weapons, guns, dope, things like that. This one's very difficult to measure, right? Where's our success if we've stopped something from happening? And that became another challenge also in terms of caseload. How do you manage this? Case clearances are an interesting thing that really are difficult to pin down when it comes to this, because how do you know when you can close a case? How long does this go on? And so we really had to learn that this is a whole new way, and then educate our middle management about what to expect. And you can't apply the same metrics that you do with a burglary unit or something along those lines to this team. And understanding why the resources are more intensive, the cases are more involved. You're going to be diving into social media. You're going to be doing a lot of things that may not be occurring in a lot of traditional style investigations. And so having the boss, the leader, the chief say, yes, we're going to do it this way, but then letting that trickle down. So we actually found that we put together from a team. This was not specific to just our city. Other cities were having the same problem with that middle layer of management. So we decided that we needed to educate them. And we found that some of the sergeants are based upon the subordinate relationships. Maybe the sergeant wasn't being listened to by the lieutenant or the captain. So what we did is we said, well, let's speak the same love language and bring it from the team. So we advocated on behalf of the things we knew to be correct or good best practices. And we used our team to sort of inform that middle level of management. And there was less pushback when it was coming from multiple voices saying the same thing, as opposed to the one. And, the relationship there may be the reason why they're just not hearing that person, or their credibility is based upon, history maybe challenged or something along those lines. So we leveraged our Palm Beach County, our threat management team, to help move those rocks a little bit when we found that there were issues with individual agencies. And we would go and have those sit downs or bring them to our meetings and let them hear what's going on so that they could learn about this new thing. And most of them came around. In fact, they usually left the meeting saying, wow, this is drastically different than anything I'm used to. Sounds like you guys know what you're doing. I'm going to go hands off and allow you to do what you need to do and just support it moving forward, as opposed to being an obstacle along the way. So that's how we sort of ran into it and developed how to speak the love language of the people we were speaking to.
I just want to throw out there on leadership. So I'm looking at the list of folks who are here today, and we've got, Mary Moriarty from Hennepin County. Hennepin County has been one of the leaders in ERPO implementation in their state. And that's largely due to the informal leadership of Raina Alexander. So that's, County Attorney Moriarty giving Raina the lead, and Raina taking that lead and running with it and offering training to local law enforcement, anyone in the county. Shoot, anyone around the county she's been a resource to everyone. She'll pick up the phone for anyone. Resources like that. both formal and informal leadership like that is huge. You've got Ryan Belka, who's with the New York AG's office. He's driving around hours every week to state police and to local agencies all around New York State. He's taken up the reins to train them. All of these, both formal and so Ryan's supervisor deserves some credit for giving him the freedom to do that, right? He sees the need for that. He's got the freedom to do it, right? And it's the two prong. It's just like my assistant chief who gave us the freedom to run the cases and work the cases in the way that we saw fit because he recognized that we had the expertise. All of these formal and informal champions and leaders around the country are why ERPO is working where they are working, right? And having those informal leaders, even in Maryland, his name escapes me, but there was a captain who was given the reins to go around and train other departments on his department's dime, right? He was given the reins to take their ERPO training and travel to other agencies all around the state, right? All of those leadership decisions and informal leaders being given the space to step up and share their knowledge and expertise is a huge factor in implementation, and it changes the culture in a state. It changes the culture in an area.
Very good. So obviously we've been talking about leadership, which clearly from what you guys have said plays a critical role in the successful implementation of an ERPO. But really everything so far has been focusing on, I guess, putting on my political scientist hat, on the executive branch. Law enforcement, the chiefs of police units, things like that, detectives who are technically executive also. But ERPOs start in the legislative branch with state legislators, and I believe we have some from state legislatures here as well, and perhaps watching later on. Based on what you've seen implemented specifically in Florida, and I know that in Massachusetts it's not used as often, and then also based on your understanding of other states as well. First of all, have you seen people going back to the legislature or the legislature revisiting ERPOs and modifying those laws to make them better? And what do you think, all of you guys think, people who are members of state legislatures ought to know to either help implement the laws that exist better or to perhaps make the laws better themselves by making some modifications?
Jay, we actually have a question in the stack about the particular changes in 2024 in Massachusetts.
I saw that. Yeah.
Would you mind kind of taking that a little bit first?
Absolutely, I'd love to. So it's funny, I started speaking about the class we teach at the college, and I remember sitting there, and this is no shot to any legislators in Massachusetts or lawyers, but I always sat there and I go, our definitions sometimes are way off. One thing was suitability. Everyone was like, what's suitability? It really wasn't defined at the time. And I think that the Reform Act, the modernization of the firearms laws in Massachusetts was, what is suitability? They kind of defined it, and it was based on like reliable, articulable, and credible information that this person, could serve and or others, based off of incidents of violence or threats, patterns of instability, repeated law enforcement contacts, even with, no convictions. Is something going on? Could something happen? We always had stuff in place for, that's where I'll kind of like draw the line between what we used to have. So also with this law, it used to be similar to a restraining order. If you had an intimate relationship, that was the definition, intimate relationship with someone, which is you're engaged, you're married, you're related by blood, you live in the same household, have a child with the respondent. That was there, but I always used to, it wasn't a joke, but it was almost like tongue in cheek. My wife knows me. We're married a long time. And that's an intimate relationship, but there's guys that know me. There are therapists, maybe from the VA or someone, a doctor who knows me, but they weren't in the law to actually be able to petition. So that was added, physicians and then LPNs and clinicians and different types of licensed therapists were all in their family therapists. They all were added to the law in 2024. Another big part of it, adding principals, assistant principals and principals of an elementary or secondary education, or the administrator of a college or university where the respondent is enrolled. I'm sure there's a lawyer, someone will say, don't worry about this, Jay, but I think of it as they say they're enrolled. So does the person graduate, the next day they go and they're not. That's me looking at the law, word for word. But those were added in there. And I think having those mental health professionals, physicians, licensed social workers, everyone in there, and school administrators, I think that's huge, because that expanded that law further. And then sometimes even, you've got different, not going too far to the side, you've got these situations where someone isn't going to tell on their significant other. They don't want to get involved. And maybe that person confides in someone else, and that gets to the physician or a therapist. People say, well, they've got Tarasov. Sure. But this is an actual mechanism that can work towards an emergency, getting that firearm away, or their license suspended and or revoked.
Thank you. Yeah. Other thoughts about either what legislatures ought to do or what they've done to modify, maybe in the Florida law? Has it been modified at all since the original version?
So no, I mean, Florida's law has remained largely intact from the beginning, and it's that's probably a good thing in that we have there have been a couple of times where our state government has had some verbal contemplating of repealing the ERPO law here in Florida. And what typically happens, we have a large group of very influential folks here in the Tri-County area who formed after the Marjory Stoneman Douglas shooting, and they run the gamut, conservative to liberal, and even those who you would categorize as very pro 2A. And what seems to keep happening is anytime there's an inkling that this law might be repealed, there's radio silence soon after, because these folks quietly make their phone calls to their state reps and to the governor, and that talk stops because people see the value in this. And what's interesting about Florida, we talk about it as an example. Florida has a benefit that I don't think people appreciate, in that our background check, the background check that we use here in Florida, is actually run by the state. So FDLE, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, runs the background check for everybody, in lieu of it going to NICS, in lieu of it going to the National Center. It still gets run there as well. But what that means in reality is that our state is able to access all state records, right? All state, every person who has been committed under a Baker Act, all police records. They have quicker access to call law enforcement agencies and get clarification on police records. They're able to run a stronger background check than most blue states. Most blue states who do state background checks actually only do them for handguns. And the long gun background check goes to the national database. I know that sounds like a small difference, but the reality is, I think Florida has a much stronger initial filter for people obtaining a firearm in the first place. And then we have a really strong backstop in our ERPO implementation, that we have this tool that's being used in every county, not evenly, but it's still being used everywhere in the state now, finally. Whereas other states have lots more filters in between, whether it's permitting or other laws around where and when somebody can possess a firearm. So what the advocates here who run the political gamut have recognized is we have a strong filter in the beginning and we have a strong backstop at the end. And if we want to make sure that we don't have another tragedy like Marjory Stoneman Douglas, we need to keep that tool in place. As is, it's working. It's not to be messed with.
Just to add to that on Florida, with Florida's law, it is law enforcement only. But we actually wondered as we were doing the paper if that may not be a lesson potentially for other red states, because a lot of the concern that we do hear from people that don't understand how it works and are fearful of having an ERPO law on the books in their state is there seems to be this recurring fear of the the tool being weaponized, that fear of, well, can my neighbor just be mad at me and call and get an ERPO on me and all of my guns are taken away? So we did question if that element of it being law enforcement only may make the law a little more palatable to people in the state of Florida and even to law enforcement themselves. There's also a couple other things at play in the Florida law, felony violation. So just, I think what we advocate for in the paper is considering those elements, those little tiny contextual elements, and questioning how is that impacting the usage? Because, when we think about it generally, having more petitioners, I mean, to me, always sounds like a good idea, right? The more people we have in a community that could catch and flag someone is in crisis, and us have an opportunity to intervene in that crisis before it escalates and before someone is hurt. I mean, more seems better. But I think we also have to consider how those small changes, like maybe it being law enforcement only, may help lower the hurdle to get something like this passed in a largely Republican state, and just help get over that hurdle of resistance to these laws more broadly.
I, you know, I agree that that's a really important point. A couple concerns, and definitely this idea of the angry spouse or angry partner calling in. I think that's always sort of a real concern. On the other hand, if it's law enforcement only, and does that add more burden to law enforcement to even be more of a social worker than they would otherwise? I mean, if they're the only ones who can do this, and they come to say to a domestic violence situation, and they want to do something. I mean, you know what I mean? It just seems like I don't know if that's the right answer or not. On the other hand, I'd like to toss this real quick to Jay because you were just talking about how Massachusetts added so many other people that can call these in. Have you seen any concerns or sort of like a improper use of these orders because of so many people can make a request?
I haven't personally seen any improper use. However, something that was brought up in a couple of classes, and I've heard it from mental health professionals. So our Section 12 is our involuntary commitment, emergency commitment in Massachusetts. When that is filled out, when an officer serves one of those, we have to enter it into CJIS, which throws up flags for a few things. Our mental health professionals that have been in those classes go, oh my goodness, I can't, like, as a police officer, I'm sitting there going, that's a good, we'll vet the thing, the 12, and we'll do what's right and per the law. But I've had mental health professionals actually look at me and go, Jay, are you serious? You have to enter that in? And I go, yeah, if we serve it, we have to enter that commitment, not commitment order, but that emergency order, the 12, into CJIS. And it's fun. Another police officer, we sit there and we agree with it, plus it's law, but they're a mental health professional going, wow, that's really strict, because sometimes the person gets evaluated and leaves, but you're still entering it. So not so much with the ERPO, but I can see it working side by side, because those questions would be fielded to me in class saying, well, with an ERPO, what happens? I feel bad. How about if I take someone's Second Amendment right away? What if I'm wrong? And it's almost the mental health community. Some of those questions were coming up, almost if they second guess themselves. Did I do the wrong thing? So I haven't seen it happen, but ironically, those questions have been posed in class. What if I make a mistake and they never get their license to carry back?
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I want to have maybe like toss one more sort of wrap-up question for you guys, and then we'll move it on to a Q&A from the audience. Basically, we'll start with Ian. Are there one or two pieces of advice that you'd like to give to the audience, which is again mostly law enforcement and criminal justice community? If there were like one or two pieces of advice related to this topic, what would you want to share with them? What are maybe a takeaway from your perspective? This audience that is largely people in leadership positions in law enforcement and criminal justice. What do you want them to take away from this conversation and from the report and from your own experience?
Sure. Thank you. Just one or two, huh? So this is really, really trying to dial it in. I think it's bigger context than just ERPO. If you've already got if we're talking about a state that already has it, It's how are you utilizing it? Maybe take a look at your agency's usage of it and determine if it's adequately being applied. And then don't be afraid to look at those around you or look at other areas. They talk about the deserts versus the high utilizers, even within our own state. If you happen to find yourself in sort of the desert category, maybe look into why that is, and look to your left and right and find your colleagues and see what they're doing differently and how they're applying that, and are they taking a different approach. Some questions could be that the unit that's tapped with it is actually overextended in other areas, and this is just something that they're not as familiar with. Yes, it's on their radar, it's their responsibility, but they don't have reps and sets and comfortability in utilizing the statute. They don't understand it. So they're not using it the way they could be using it. So building relationships is key to targeted violence prevention. You have to have relationships with your partners in law enforcement as well as community resources. This is a tool, but that's the only way you get people off, pathways to violence and work through those things is, like you said, you can't be the social worker, but you need to know who you can call to refer this person to and then work that problem alongside them. And then if you're interested at all in what this bigger overarching threat assessment, behavioral threat management process looks like, there is an amazing publication that came out in about 2016, produced by the FBI. In my opinion, one of the best publications they've done, called Making Prevention a Reality. It's available on the FBI's website. Shameless plug for them, but it's a resource that I carry with me daily and frequently go back to its use. And it's a fantastic piece of operational literature that allow you to understand what we're trying to get to, explain the processes, and then even build a team to support your agency's objectives and intent if you decide to have one. But I'm of the opinion, if you decided to do this, you need to have a dedicated team that works these things, because it's a nuanced cultural shift in law enforcement that requires sort of a different look at it. We also found that you need to have significant buy-in from the sergeants and the folks. We saw areas, like I reiterated earlier, people who were placed in positions to be over these threat units that didn't quite understand what they were managing, and it sort of fell apart. So you need to have people who have bought into what we're trying to accomplish, and then sort of professionalize their understanding of that, utilizing resources that are usually within your own community. You just have to be willing to open the door and ask the questions, and there's plenty of people to help. So that's why more than two, but my list of things to go after.
Thank you. Jay?
Thank you. The one thing that I always look at is, and I don't want to name situations or states or whatnot, but I look at when a horrific firearm crime happens, whether it's schools or a workplace or just random shootings. And I look and I say, everyone's going to blame someone. Someone's going to come to blame. And then they go back in time. Well, this person met with this person, and they were in the hospital at this point. I think the Massachusetts law being expanded now I want people to feel comfortable. Those mental health professionals, those physicians, school administrators, to feel comfortable to come forward and utilize law enforcement. That's why it's important that law enforcement have partnerships too, because even if a person who can't petition now has that ability, they can look and say, geez, am I going too far? What are my beliefs? Am I pro 2A? Well, I can't take this away from someone, even though I think they may be a threat. Well, collaborate with law enforcement. Ask, am I going overboard? Should I file this? Could you do it on my behalf? And that's the way I look at it in Massachusetts. As Chris said when we were speaking last week informally, he thinks personally where I stand on things, and he's true. We have a Second Amendment right. However, we cannot allow people to take other people's lives. We can't allow, as police leaders or politicians, anything, we can't allow firearms to be used to take children's lives, adults' lives, anyone's. And we need to really look at protecting. I say this in class, we need to protect that Second Amendment right, but we also have to have mechanisms in place that unsuitable people will not have firearms legally. People will get stuff illegally. We know this happens, but I think we need to work in partnership with our mental health and our mental health partners in our schools to figure out how we can save lives through using an ERPO.
Thank you. Tara?
Yeah, I would say the takeaways for me from doing the paper is that the tendency to treat ERPOs as the same tool broadly across states has real operational consequences. I think it's really important, to the leaders that are here in this room today. It's really important that you consider not just the difference between these tools between states, but really within your own state. Look at those disparities. Where is it being used? Where is it being used well? Where is it not being used? And address those disparities, because I think that is the most actionable place that you have. That is the place that you can make the most difference. Look at those disparities in your state. Use the paper, use the framework to help you understand what's happening, where you are. And then, I think it comes down to training, resources, and doing something to address those gaps. And I think the paper gives you a good framework. And if you have committed leadership and resources put into training, there can be a significant improvement to public safety.
Very good. Very good. And Chris, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important to get down to the local level when you're looking at implementation and you're looking at how ERPO is being used in your state. So right down to the county, right down to the jurisdiction. And here's why. So you take a state like Minnesota, where you have the Twin Cities, and then you have a rural north, and those are two very different concerns around firearm violence. The north of the state, suicide is a real problem in those rural and more remote counties and remote destinations, where the Twin Cities deal with the diaspora. They deal with domestic violence, street violence, and suicide. So the tool needs to speak to the problem. And what can be overwhelming with ERPO is that it can be used in so many different situations in so many different ways. And what often ends up happening is the top wants to tell the people on the ground how to use the tool, instead of the top taking the time to understand where the problem is for the folks on the ground and helping them use it in the way that they feel is most important and most impactful for their community. So taking that time to talk to your county leadership and your municipality leadership and finding out where are you seeing this problem? What's your biggest concern? Is it guns in schools? Is that okay? Then how do we focus on using this tool to prevent that from happening first? And then you continue. And that's what we saw. That's what I saw here in Florida. At first, ERPO was a tool to prevent school shootings, to prevent targeted violence. That's what it was for. And as we got good at using it and we saw how useful it was, our eyes broadened, our view broadened. But it was successful because we used it for the thing that we saw as the biggest problem first. And we got really good at using it for that first. And then we looked at the next thing that it could be useful for. It's been used in the first case. The first case of somebody being convicted for violating an ERPO in the state of Florida was a Broward County case. And it was a gentleman who had been involved in 4 different shootings. He was a menace in his community. This wasn't a targeted violence case, but once they had gotten good at recognizing how to use it and they got good at using the tool, then they were able to use it to intervene in community and gang violence. So be responsive to your communities, support them in the way that they feel that this tool could be the most useful. Do that first, open the door, and then you can talk about how you also see this tool being used in their community, and you'll get a better dialogue, you'll get a better response, and you'll get stronger implementation because agencies are going to be using it in the way that in where their heart is. They're going to be using it where they feel it's going to be the most impactful and helpful to the people that they serve.
I think I'm getting a theme from everybody on the panel just now, and also through the conversation. Tip O'Neill used to say all politics is local. We could sort of say all ERPOs are local, and the different the context, rural versus urban, all the stuff you've talked about, which underscores a thought I had when I read the report initially. A lot of people have talked in the past about, or some people have proposed a federal red flag law. And initially, I thought, hey, that sounds like a really good idea. But frankly, after reading your report, and even more so after listening to this conversation, I'm wondering just how practical that would be. And I'm really wondering, is it at a federal level, perhaps a better response would be the Congress encouraging and perhaps offering funding for state level ERPOs to go all the way down into localities. But the idea, I mean, a one size fits all doesn't even fit in a state, let alone for the country. We have over 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the U.S. So I hadn't really thought about that until I read your report, but I think that's another takeaway for me from what's been going on. We have a few minutes left, and I see there's a couple of questions here in the chat. I wanted to raise one for starters, and that is one person writes that they've heard about opposition to calling for an ERPO or resistance to it because they're afraid that if that it might discourage gun owners from seeking mental health care because they're worried that a clinician might file for an ERPO or a police officer or whatever. It might take away their rights or whatever, and that they won't actually seek mental health care. Now, I don't remember which state it was, but I remember in the report there was at least one state where not only were the guns temporarily seized, but there was mental health assistance was offered as well. I forget which state that was, but is that a concern that you have seen? I mean, this idea that a mental health stigma might be attached with an ERPO, and that might make people, perhaps even law enforcement themselves, reluctant to implement one. And if so, what can be done to overcome that?
So a couple things. I think it's a valid concern. I mean, I've seen the three of us have seen that concern amongst law enforcement. Right. There's a stigma, and because we could lose our, as a law enforcement officer, if you lose your ability to carry your firearm, that's your career. So we've definitely seen that, and we've seen a cultural shift in law enforcement. And Jay does a lot of work around this himself, around mental health in law enforcement. So it's in trying to reduce that stigma and get people to seek help when they need it. So the concern is valid. A couple of things. So I think educating clinicians and educating folks in the mental health field as to how ERPOs work, what the thresholds are, and helping them to get the word out to their clients, to the folks at large, so people understand what that threshold is. And the threshold for an ERPO is already essentially the same as for a clinician, is already the same essentially as when they would have to report anyway, right? If you tell your clinician, before ERPO ever existed, if you say to your clinician that you are seriously contemplating taking your own life, they have a duty to report and intervene. That already exists in the law. The ERPO is actually a benefit, but not if you don't understand it. It's a benefit in that the clinician, instead of seeking to commit you, could intervene and keep you in an outpatient setting and use the ERPO. The reason they're committing you is to keep you away from firearms. They don't have to take you out of your family, out of your home, if they have a tool that could simply remove the firearms temporarily. But it's not understood well enough, right? I think a lot of folks still look at it as a punitive measure when it's really meant to be therapeutic and functions therapeutically. It's meant to create time and space between someone in crisis and their firearms. And if clinicians are educated on how to use them and how to use them well, I think it's a point where they could be building trust with clients to say, hey, listen, when they get served with the order, they talk to their client and say, hey, listen, I had the option to either file for you to be committed because I was concerned about the comments you made in our last session. I instead decided to file for the ERPO. I want us to continue to work on this, and I want you to be home and with your family. I could see this being done in a way that is beneficial, but it takes training. It takes resources from the top down, right? From the state, hopefully from the federal government. We can get them to continue to fund ERPO training and ERPO implementation through SCIP, because that as it stands, that will come to an end in a couple of years. But that's been a huge benefit to states that have accepted that funding. But I think it takes training clinicians and clinicians having open dialogue with their clients about what that tool is and what it isn't, and what their thresholds are.
If I can just add to that, Chris, I think something that Ian brought in a few times is the element of BTAM, and it gives it, when you look at that, clinicians familiarizing themselves with that, it gives you a clear pathway to understand where someone may be on a progression toward violence, and that being integrated with ERPO, which is, the training that 97% does. A lot of it is integrating BTAM with ERPO. So, that I'm saying this person may need an ERPO because they are at this point on a pathway to violence, and you can clearly articulate what progression may have happened leading up to that. It's not an arbitrary, I got a feeling that this person is a problem. It is grounded in evidence-based assessment of escalating behaviors.
Can I interrupt 1 second? I'm going to place a slide up. I know some folks are going to have to pop
thank you.
off as we go. As we finish up the last 10 minutes, these are the contacts for all of us on the panel today. We're probably not going to get through all the questions. I'm going to do my best with Melissa to get those and get you and email you responses as best I can. But we're gonna continue for the last 10 minutes. But I wanted to make sure everybody had access to our contacts before we wrap up.
There was another question about what does successful ERPO implementation look like in rural areas where you don't have the kind of resources, either personnel or other resources that larger urban areas or bigger states might have. How do you actually assess that? And any thoughts on that in the rural sections?
I mean, I can say this. So there are lots of models right here in Florida that have worked. They're not all, and from small agencies to large agencies. We have one agency in Central Florida that has one sergeant assigned to ERPOs. Patrol is still responsible to identify when a case might need an ERPO, and they become the original petitioners, but then the case is assisted by the sergeant and then managed by that sergeant. There are smaller agencies, and it's like any other issue, right? So if you have let's take the extreme example of a rural agency with 5 sheriffs for an enormous swath of land, right? And now you're responsible for ERPO as well. Well, it's like any other responsibility. I'm sure one of those 5 sheriffs is your homicide sheriff, right? If you had a homicide, that's who's going out, and they're trained for death investigations. If you had a narcotics issue, I'm sure one of those 5 sheriffs has the training. Really, it's just important that at least one person in your agency is capable to step in, and that the other 5 just understand when it's time to trigger that process, right? It doesn't have to be. Palm Beach County is an enormous county, and it's a populous county, and I commend them on putting the resources and the personnel into the apparatus that they've set up, and they have been a huge support to all of the other agencies in the county. They're responsible to support the other agencies in the county the way they're set up. But when you have a smaller population and a smaller agency, there is still a way to do it and do it well. It doesn't have to be the enormous undertaking that it is in larger, more populous counties and cities.
Very good. Thank you. Another takeaway I'm getting from this is when we talk about budgets, just how important funding is for training. And all of you have been stressing the importance of training in ERPO and BTAM, things like that. And I think a lot of times for people outside of law enforcement and outside the criminal justice system, when you think about funding the police, it's always about the kinetic stuff, equipment, things like that. But the training is essential, especially if we are asking law enforcement officers to do more, especially if an ERPO is designed where only law enforcement are the ones who can initiate it. There needs to be much more training in how, not only what the ERPO is, but also in making assessments and things like that. And training costs money. And these are things that you would hope would get maybe even some bipartisan support, especially if it's aimed at what can we do, as I said at the very beginning in my opening comments, what can we do to reduce the number of non-fatal shootings and gun deaths in the United States, whether suicide, homicide, accidental, whatever. Everybody, I think most Americans would agree that that is something that we want to reduce. And law enforcement can clearly play an important role in that. I have a question of my own I'd like to ask, especially for those in Florida. Has the move toward permitless carry or so-called constitutional carry, has that impacted at all on ERPO implementation or on the willingness or attitudes of law enforcement to invoke those? Has that had any effect whatsoever? I'm just curious about that. That's something that Indiana has moved to a couple of years ago also.
I don't have a great answer for you, unfortunately. I'm going to tell you that I left law enforcement before this law was created. I can take a stab at an assumption, and that is you're going to have more opportunities to find out who's not reliably or using sound judgment with a firearm based upon the opportunities that may make firearms more accessible than they would have otherwise, because you no longer have the hurdle of a law that requires you to carry it with a permit in certain types of carrying situations. So there may be incidences where you're going to now have folks introducing firearms more quickly into conflict that may not have otherwise existed. And so you may get a kind of a glimpse to see if this is the type of person who has a history of this, that type of thing. So there may be more chances for that to occur, but that's anecdotal, and I don't have any research to back that up. It happened in the last 2 years, and I've been gone from law enforcement for 3 now. So
sure. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't seen a huge influx of news stories, and you would have what I might have expected, but I think this actually goes back to the 5 points, and one of those is culture, right? So, yes, we passed permitless carry, but where I am in Fort Lauderdale, it's just not socially acceptable to walk around with your AR-15 slung across your chest as you go to Publix. It's just not, and if you're doing it, it's probably because you want attention and you're testing out the law. It's not because you have any practical reason that you would want to do that. So we're not seeing that happen. And my guess is the more rural counties already had open carry for when you're going hunting or fishing. There were already exceptions to carry laws that were on the books. So my assumption is that we're not seeing a huge change in behavior where more people are carrying necessarily than already were. And I say that with full knowledge that for the first year and a half that I worked in Florida versus New York City, that I was very uncomfortable with how many people I handed a firearm back to after a traffic stop. It was a very different culture coming here and working here than it was there. So my guess is, and we'll see as the years go on and as these laws play out and as we have more numbers, but my assumption is that culture is overtaking the change in the law and that the norms are still the norms.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And of course, permitless carry also applies to concealed. And I know in Indiana, we're seeing a lot more people committing, frankly, kind of rage shootings and things like that, fight escalation, because they're carrying concealed weapons, whereas they didn't have to before we had a license system. You had to pass a criminal background check, and now you don't. And so again, I was just kind of wondering, I guess it's down the line, we'll have more data to actually look at that as to what effect that might have. We have a couple more minutes left, and I'm looking at the questions. One, I guess maybe this final question: if ERPO adoption and use rates are not really a red-blue thing, which I guess your study kind of shows that, how confident can policymakers be about what variables would drive adaptation and use outcomes in their states? So if it's not red versus blue, what are, again, maybe based on a very quick review of your study?
I think that comes down to each individual location. I think that there has been a tendency to want to find model policies that can be copied from one place and applied to another. And I think what we found in the analysis is that that doesn't work. So it's not a red-blue thing. It is specific to where you are. And I think those 5 dimensions in the paper will give you a good starting point to assess how ERPO functions in your given context.
Very good. Or like I said, all ERPOs are local, right? Yeah, Chris?
Well, I will say Maryland stands out as kind of an anomaly in that they've probably continued to make the most adjustment and change to their law to the point where half of their ERPO, unlike any other state, about half of their ERPOs are actually petitioned for other than law enforcement. So whether it's family members and clinicians, the public. So about half of the ERPO petitions in Maryland are from the public and only half are law enforcement. And That's likely a result of lots of small changes that they made to increase access. There's 24-hour magistrates to open for the public to start the application process. They've made exceptions to where if the respondent is technically not legally possessing the firearm, they've made exceptions where if they serve the ERPO, they won't make the arrest necessarily,
Hmm.
which again opens up access. You have a man who's 65, 70 years old, there's a firearm in the house, and he was convicted of a robbery when he was 30. The family wouldn't call the police to get the gun out of there if they knew he was going to go to jail, right? So making those adjustments in the law and those exceptions so that the law can be as accessible, therapeutic, and effective as possible does result in change. So I guess the one thing that can change at the top when you pass these laws in a new state is putting resources behind it, making resources available to local agencies and to the public to get trained, to educate the public, to educate all the people that are going to be involved.
Absolutely. So I think walking away from this, I mean, the localism and local context is essential. Funding and resources is essential. And also, as you just noted, and also with the case of Massachusetts, from the legislative perspective, revisiting the law and making adjustments, which frankly is one of the jobs of the legislature anyway. And I know Indiana did that with our Jake Laird law a couple years ago. We modified it a little bit to tighten up certain things. Laws are always works in progress, and as you see them implement, you should be able to modify them and make them better over time. And that's something people should remember. They're not just fixed in time forever. They can change, but the local context and funding and training are very important. We are out of time. Thank you so much, Chris and Tara, for your study and your input, and Ian and Jay for all of your insights. And thank you all for your service, and thank you in the audience. And I hope you found this presentation from 97% useful for you as you move forward, and hopefully ERPOs will be more widespread and will help reduce all different types of firearms violence and trauma that we see in the country. So I guess with that, thank you so much, and take care.